Well, as we head into the weekend, and of course, the House is in recess until after Thanksgiving, but I just want to give a reminder to encourage each of you to pray for the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and his family. I know him well. I served with him in Congress. He is deeply committed to his faith, deeply committed to his family, and is, of course, to our country. And he's in a position right now where he and Congress as a whole, they're just facing so many issues, urgent issues, that will demand tremendous focus and wisdom and courage. And that's why we at FRC are doing so. And we are asking you to join us in praying for Speaker Mike Johnson and his family. So I'm going to ask, if you will, to join us by signing a pledge. Simply text the word speaker to 67742. Speaker to 67742. Or if you prefer, you can go online to frc.org/House Speaker. We want to encourage Mike Johnson and let him know how many people all across the country are praying for him and his family. All right, as I discussed earlier in the program, there are so many public schools today that spend, frankly, so much time not focused on the basics of education, but instead indoctrinating students on how to bow down to what we refer to as the unholy trinity. That would be radical LGBT, abortion, and climate change ideology. And as the schools seem so bent on this type of indoctrination, it should not come as a surprise that we are seeing so many students struggling, and they don't even know many of the things that they should know at this particular point of their age. So how many don't even know why we celebrate Thanksgiving, for example? To many of them, it's just a day to eat turkey. And that's so unfortunate, because there's so much that we can learn from the Pilgrims' early trials. In fact, all of us would do well to be reminded of that. So here to give us a little history lesson and to provide some practical applications in this postmodern age is the executive director of the Plymouth Rock Foundation, Dr. Paul Jehle. Dr. Jehle, welcome back to Washington Watch. Great to have you.
Yes, good to be back with you at this time,
listen,
especially.
That's right. No better time than right here. So let's just jump into it, Dr. Jehle. Jog our collective memories, if you will. Why did the Pilgrims decide to leave England?
Well, of course, the Pilgrim story has many breadths in it. And in fact, probably the best way to illustrate it is the fact that the Pilgrim story is essentially a story of a church plant. The church had about 350 members in Leiden, Holland. By the time they left, with about 75 coming to the wilderness here of America, their endeavor was to plant a church. If you'd ask a question, what would a bunch of Christians, they weren't all Christians that were there, and some of them were not a part of their church, but how would you apply the Bible in the way they were trained by their own pastor and to live out their faith in every area of life? They had to apply the Bible to immigration when they went to Holland. They had to apply the Bible in how they would operate with economics once they got here, how to erect a civil government. You know, sometimes we forget that the Pilgrims were very well trained by their pastor and were very consciously attempting to follow the scriptures. They weren't perfect. They were like all the rest of us. But I think that the critical aspect of that is they didn't just come here because of persecution in Holland, though that was certainly that dictated their timing. But they came here, as they said, when they wrote, their number one reason was to propagate and advance the gospel of the kingdom of Christ into these remote parts of the world, though we would be stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work. And as a paraphrase of that statement, that meant that they wanted to be stepping stones for their children, their grandchildren, and future generations. And there's much to glean from the Pilgrim story. I've studied it for decades and, of course, live right here near Plymouth, Massachusetts. And so I'm able to conduct tours, often in costume, and to help people understand their motives in coming here. There's much more that can be said, especially when you think of Thanksgiving. And I just highlight that the idea of Thanksgiving, it took place as a 3-day feast that took place with the Wampanoag in probably October of 1621. But in order to understand the context of that Thanksgiving, we have to set the stage a bit to recognize it. Often in schools today, the Pilgrims are barely mentioned, if at all. They're skipped over completely. The Puritans, when they come in 1630, are sometimes referred to, but not too positively. And we have this problem of amnesia in America when it comes to history. And even today, often it is simply retold in a revised way or a very shallow way with some grains of truth. And yet we all know that if we're going to understand a Bible passage as Christians, we have to understand the context in which it was first written. What did it mean to the original hearers? We need to have the same truth appearing in several books of the Bible if we're going to make it a real foundational truth. And indeed, then we can apply it to the present day. And this is what we've lost with history. We're not teaching history in its original context, what it was like in the 1600s at that time period, so that we can really get this context. We're not often searching for primary sources to be able to confirm both facts and how they were utilized at the time period. So indeed, this is something that can be done by any family. We can start at any rate. Here in Plymouth Rock Foundation, we at plymrock.org, plymrock.org, we have a bookstore. We have many books that are available, especially a primary source document, Mort's Relation, where this was published in the 1980s. It was originally written in 1624, published, one of the first books the Pilgrims published at all. And they're finally over in England. And yet this is brought into tremendous amount of footnotes in this volume, and you could teach the entire Thanksgiving story right around your dinner table from this one book. And it's not a long book, but we have a collector's edition that we sell because we want to be able to get those primary sources back into the hearts and minds of America's families. And we need this message of Thanksgiving.
Absolutely. This is such a critical part of our history that's not being taught anymore. And when you talk about the Pilgrims coming over with the blessing of their pastors and well grounded in the scripture, I see that spectacular painting behind you. Can't see it all, but there's a similar picture in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol of the Pilgrims landing here on our soil. And right in the center of the picture is the Bible, and their focus was on the Bible. I guarantee that painting would not be in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol were it not actual, true history. And what you're saying is absolutely true, but it's not being taught as you mentioned. Now, one other thing that the Pilgrims, and many people may not be aware of this, actually had two types of prayer services, as I understand it. Can you fill us in, unpack
sure.
each of those types for us?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the Puritan and Pilgrim theology were somewhat similar. The Pilgrims had a different concept of government, but they had government by consent. That's really the heritage of our American government eventually. But the Pilgrims practiced two kinds of prayer services. It came to be a pattern. One was a humiliation day of fasting and prayer, usually conducted in the spring, to pray and to confess any sin that may be in our hearts, and to pray for a bountiful growing season, prosperity on economics and various areas of their needs as a church and a colony. And then in the fall, they would have a Thanksgiving service that would be thanking God for the provisions of that prayer in the spring. Now, the Pilgrims conducted these as church events within their own church calendar. And it's good to keep in mind that the Pilgrims leaned on the Jewish calendar. So they, of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford, actually starts the year in March, closer to where we would celebrate Passover from the Old Testament. And then, of course, into the New Testament, not the New Testament, but by the fall, I mean, they would be having a Thanksgiving service. We understand that scripturally, the Thanksgiving feast was the Feast of Tabernacles. And we recognize that most likely this pattern was drawn from Scripture and from the new year in praying to God and in thanking God. Now, the Thanksgiving festival that took place, this 3-day feast that took place in October of 1621, at least we presume it's October, there's no exact date, but based on this was a bit different. It drew from both of these in their church, but this was more a community type celebration. In Leiden, Holland, as well as in England, there were harvest festivals, certainly taking their pattern, at least distantly, from what was conducted within the church, like a Feast of Tabernacles or Thanksgiving. But basically, this was the idea of still giving thanks to God for all your provisions, and then having this blessing of this harmony that would be taking place in a community, bringing an entire community together, larger than the church, beyond the walls of the church. This is what really we look at with this. It's interesting to note that this was a 3-day feast, not a 3-day fast. It had several elements which are quite unique. Not the first people. The Pilgrims aren't the first people to thank God when they arrived on a shore. They're certainly not the first people, even among the natives. They would thank God for their provisions and whatnot, but it has several unique qualities about it. First of all, we need to see its context, because by October of 1621, when this took place, this probably Thanksgiving would not have taken place as a community with the Wampanoag, 90 of the Wampanoag coming, according to Bradford's history there, with about only 51 or 52 pilgrims left alive after that first winter, only 4 adult women. And you look at this and you say, this would not have taken place if 2 other events didn't take place prior to it. One was the fact that the Pilgrims did come with a different kind of philosophy than what was called the doctrine of discovery, where you would go to a nation and you would take over its inhabitants, steal their land, rape their ground and whatnot, and then try to convert them. The Pilgrims came with a desire to make peace. They were instructed to get peace with the natives, to do everything you can to inhabit unused land of all kinds, and to pay for the land. So we have a tradition here in New England. You can look at all the private property deeds that were done with the signature of the native chiefs to see this. Now, this is interesting because that peace treaty was conducted in March of 1621. There was a peace between the natives and the Pilgrims. Now, the natives wanted it as well because they had all kinds of issues with others, and they had 22 of their own natives stolen and taken as slaves 6 years before the Pilgrims came. So they weren't happy with the Europeans that were coming over for good reason. And so that was very significant. But even more significant, I think, was the meeting they had in August. You see, the Pilgrims took some corn out of the soil that they found, knowing that the seed they brought would not grow any corn. Therefore, they took it, and under common law, they had to promise each other that they would pay this back. And when they had that peace treaty, they did say they would pay it back to the Nauset tribe on the Cape Cod. And interestingly enough, one of the boys of an undisciplined family ran away and got taken by the natives, and the natives informed Massasoit, who was the chief making the peace with the Pilgrims, that they had this boy. So now they had an opportunity to go and retrieve the boy, but also apologize for the sins of their race, that previously this tribe had been robbed of 22 of their men. They even saw a 100-year-old woman standing on the shore, wouldn't look at the Pilgrims, wouldn't look at the English, and kept sobbing. They asked why. She said she had been deprived of her children and grandchildren. And then you recognize that Bradford gives an apology, that this was wrong, that they should not do this, and repays them for the corn that they took. This is significant because this means this second event, a kind of a reconciliation and an apology, would pave the way for a 3-day feast, think of it, with another culture that had been robbed of their own youth, that were bitter and could easily have said, we have every reason to wipe this small group out. And here you have a recipe in American history. If this was taught in its context, we would be honoring the Native American for forgiving the sins of the race of the English and the Europeans so quickly, and thanking the Pilgrims for being willing to openly say their race was not proper. This is a recipe for harmony. How many families will join around Thanksgiving tables with friends and relatives they don't agree with politically? They don't agree with in hardly any area. They may be Christians, non-Christians. So what? We have in America a small template of an example of 2 cultures that came together, friendly enough to feast together. The natives brought most of the food. The Pilgrims didn't have a whole lot of food. They had recreational games. We don't know all the details to those together for 3 days. You don't for 3 days feast with someone you can't stand or someone you completely don't trust. And yet 2 cultures can come together, completely different beliefs, be on all sides of it, and yet this can take place. This is the true legacy of Thanksgiving, the true significance of what we need to recognize here in America, rather than reacting with only bits and pieces of history, jumping to extremes. That's where we get the ideas of privilege and critical race theory and all those other kinds of things. We need to return and learning from history. I exhort families to get some of the primary sources of these things, and you can read them to individuals, especially Mort's Relation, this classic first edition that we have, even in our bookstore, plymrock.org, and then read it to your children. Let's start a new legacy.
All right, Dr. Jehle,
from the heart.
Yeah, we've got less than a minute left. Give us your website again so people can go there.
It's plymrock.org, plymrock.org, Plymouth Rock Foundation, and go right to the bookstore for any of these sources. But I can tell you the significance of Thanksgiving in Plymouth could be a lesson and a message to this nation.